Toys for Bob was a subsidiary of Activision based in California. Founded originally in 1989, the company went on to create the hugely successful Skylanders franchise before breathing new life into 90s gaming icons Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon. For a time, the studio appeared to be going from strength to strength, until the early 2020s when their staff numbers steadily dwindled and they stopped making games of their own, with one notable exception. That was Crash Team Rumble, an online multiplayer Crash Bandicoot game that was ultimately short-lived. In this video, I'll be asking the question, what happened to Toys for Bob? Why did this maker of successful nostalgic platformers shrink and change in the way that it did between 2020 and 2024? With input from former developers, we'll examine the unusual development of Crash Team Rumble, take an exclusive look at some of their cancelled projects, and uncover the vision that they once had for the future of Crash and Spyro. Toys for Bob marked its debut in 1991 with Star Control, a landmark sci-fi strategy action game for home computers and the Sega Mega Drive. In the following years, they would develop a number of follow-ups before their pivot to licensed games around the turn of the century. Throughout the 2000s, games using TV and film licenses were a booming business, and Toys for Bob was keen to take advantage of that. Their work on games like Madagascar provided the studio with a steady stream of revenue, allowing them to support their growing crew of developers. These games were published by Activision in the beginning of a close partnership between the two companies. In 2005, they would deepen their ties further when Activision acquired Toys for Bob in its entirety. In the short term, this allowed the team greater stability and the opportunity to work on Activision franchises like Tony Hawk, but uncertainty lay ahead. While Toys for Bob's licensed games were generally well received, the market had become crowded with low-quality titles pumped out to meet tight deadlines. By the late 2000s, this once bountiful well had become poisoned. Players were gravitating towards licensed games less and less, prompting Toys for Bob to begin shifting away from them. What the studio needed now was an IP of their own. They began an initiative to find the next big thing with the backing of Activision. This entailed months of internal experiments, from which emerged a prototype combining action figures with RFID chips. While Activision was willing to take on a degree of risk by funding the costly production of this toy-centric enterprise, they suggested Toys for Bob use one of their existing properties to entice players to the new game. They would ultimately choose Spyro, a decision that studio founder Paul Ritchie has said was key to defining the style and humor of the series, and instrumental to it finding an audience. The project was given the working title of Spyro's Kingdom before eventually evolving into Skylanders Spyro's Adventure, which launched in 2011 to huge commercial success. This marked the genesis of a popular new franchise, spawning multiple sequels and spin-offs. Toys for Bob would go on to develop these games alongside fellow Activision subsidiary Vicarious Visions throughout the 2010s. But the Toys to Life craze that the developers had kickstarted with Skylanders eventually trailed off as the decade went on. The market grew increasingly saturated, and consumers in turn started to lose interest, leading to a decline in sales. The true death knell for Skylanders, however, arrived in 2016 with the launch of Skylanders Imaginators from Toys for Bob. This game brought with it a number of new features, including the option to make your own Skylanders and playable Crash Bandicoot characters, but this wasn't enough to attract consumers. Although it was well received like previous entries, the game was a flop, selling only 66,000 units in its first month on sale in North America. This was a precipitous 41% drop from how its predecessor Skylanders Superchargers performed. Activision responded by scrapping future plans for the series, including a game early into development at Vicarious Visions. See my video on Vicarious Visions for more on that. Toys for Bob, meanwhile, was cast into another period of uncertainty. Rumours briefly swirled at Activision that their leadership was considering downsizing or even closing Toys for Bob altogether. Bitterly disappointed with the performance of Skylanders Imaginators, the studio became a prime candidate for cuts among Activision's heads. Ultimately, they elected to eliminate their art department almost entirely. Up until 2017, Toys for Bob had employed a team of full-time artists. Then Activision determined that they could save money by firing those people and replacing them with contract workers. These would be artists working remotely who would be paid less and receive fewer benefits. With these changes implemented, the studio's future remains somewhat unclear for the time being. One thing that was for certain though was the rise of remakes and remasters playing out at the time, which Activision was at the forefront of. Alongside work on Imaginators, Toys for Bob had been supporting the development of the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy, a remastered collection of the original Crash trilogy led by Vicarious Visions. As the launch of the game approached, demand for remasters of other games from that era, namely Spyro, began to grow, and Toys for Bob was listening. Given their history with the character, their experience gathered from the Crash Insane trilogy, and their availability for a new project, the opportunity presented itself for them to helm remasters of the original Spyro trilogy for modern systems. Although it soon became clear that more than mere remastering was in order. Early into development on the project, Toys for Bob made contact with Insomniac Games, the creators of the first Spyro games, in an effort to procure the relevant source code. However, they were told that Insomniac had lost the original assets. They were rumoured to have been misplaced during a company move. In order to move forward, Toys for Bob had to essentially rebuild the entire 3 games from scratch. This entailed a painstaking process of combing over every creature and environment in an emulator and faithfully recreating it, consulting the original developers when necessary. They were aided in this endeavour massively by an invention called Spyroscope, which was made by a single programmer at the company named Steve Mariotti. This was a piece of software written over the course of just 2 months that scanned each game in an emulator and extracted the shapes and positions of each asset in the game world. In 2024, I spoke to Steve Mariotti, who offered the following technical specifics on how he achieved this. Quote, I hacked up an open source PS1 emulator to inspect the PS1 memory, and sent data over WinSock TCP sockets to a separate program I wrote using OpenGL running on the same computer to visualize and export the data. Spyroscope allowed them to essentially take a reading of each environment, including where every enemy and element was placed, so they could reimagine the art with the exact same scaling and level design intact. This would become an invaluable tool as they took on the enormous task of remaking 3 different games in around little over 1 year. Not only was this much less time than Vicarious Visions was given for the Insane trilogy, but it was undeniably the bigger job given the larger scope of Spyro's worlds. To meet this deadline, some work was outsourced to other studios like Vicarious Visions and Sanzaru Games. Ultimately, the core team ended up requesting more time to polish it up, which Activision agreed to. The Spyro Reignited trilogy was pushed from its initial target of September 2018 to its final release date of November 13, 2018. Partway into development on Spyro in late 2017, Toys for Bob expanded their ambitions even more and chose to take on another original project based around the Crash Bandicoot series. Earlier that year, the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy had launched to massive success, moving over 2.5 million units in its first 3 months alone. As such, Activision was finally open to continuing the series after years of shooting down pitches for new games. Some fans around this time speculated that Vicarious Visions, the primary developer behind the remastered trilogy, would be the natural fit to take on the next Crash game, but that was never planned to be the case. Before the Insane trilogy was even finished, Activision had already decided that Vicarious would shift towards providing additional work on Destiny 2 and Call of Duty. This left an opening for Toys for Bob to pick up the baton. Rather than a traditional single-player Crash title, however, their first take on the series was a multiplayer game. The core concept of it was that 2 teams would compete to collect the most Wumpa fruit in a large 3D world, and there were a few different ideas for how they would go about this. Some early plans tied with the idea of objective-based asymmetric gameplay. For instance, one scenario considered revolved around a rocket launch site on a snowy mountaintop. One team would collect Wumpa to fuel a rocket, whereas the opposing team would collect them to feed a large Yeti. Either one team would supply the rocket with the fuel needed to blast off, or the other would strengthen the ravenous Yeti enough for it to sabotage the launch. It wasn't until 2018 that this project, codenamed Lava, would begin to take shape as an early demo came together. Internally, this prototype was often referred to simply as Crash Multiplayer, but its de facto working title was Wumpa League. In their demo, 2 teams of 4 would scour wide open 3D levels for Wumpa Fruit and bring it to their team's bank to add it to their total score. Matches played out over the course of 3 rounds, each one set in a different level, and the team with the most Wumpa banked at the end of each 5-minute round would score 1 point in a best of 3 setup. Players could diminish the Wumpa count of opponents by attacking them and knock them out either by whittling down their health or by bumping them into stage hazards like bottomless pits. Over time, the gameplay evolved somewhat, and in addition to Wumpa, players would also collect melons and capture bananas by standing on pads for a few seconds to mark them for their team. A variety of different characters from the series were playable, including all of those later made playable in Crash Bandicoot 4, which were Crash, Coco, Torna, Dingodile, and Dr. Neocortex. Other characters being built for their prototypes around this stage included Fake Crash, Ripperoo, Papu Papu, Embryo, N-Jin, and Nina Cortex. Each of the 5 characters from Crash 4 played essentially the same as they did in that game, with a few extra movement and combat options that were unique to each of them. For example, Cortex could launch himself vertically in a special move that doubled as an attack. All characters also came equipped with a parachute that could be deployed at any time with the left shoulder button to glide around levels. Players were able to catch updrafts with the parachutes in certain stages to propel themselves upwards. Some of these early prototypes utilized fan art as placeholder assets, such as this piece created by artist Fierce the Bandit, which was used in an early Wumpa League banner. The levels in Wumpa League were intended to be completely original creations inspired by the Crash universe, each with their own unique hazards and features. One tested out was a harbour in which players would run along boardwalks above a sea of toxic water. Every so often, waves would ripple through the level, forcing competitors to scale higher in order to survive. Players could take out their opponents by using a turret located towards the center of the battlefield. A creature known as the Wumpa Whale would swim throughout the map, which players could land on to rapidly gain Wumpas. Another level took place in a chemical plant, where liquid nitro filled the bottom of the level, but would periodically be drained, putting additional deposits of Wumpa fruit up for grabs for those willing to risk it. Many other stages were envisioned, such as Dr. Embryo's mansion, a treacherous cliffside filled with exposed wiring and the remnants of his past experiments. There was a world set high above the clouds, a docking station for airships of different kinds, like a cargo plane players could bounce on. Players could even commandeer small aeroplanes to fly around and fire on opponents. Art also existed for a setting where players would ride minecarts. All of these levels were vast and wide open for exploration, a direction one developer told me was inspired by Super Mario 64. Early in development, Wumpa League toyed with a handful of mechanics that were ultimately never implemented, like animal companions who would assist you, mounts, wall running, rails characters could grind on, and the ability to grab and throw other players. At one point in 2018, the team even considered adding characters from other Activision franchises to the roster, such as Ghost from Call of Duty, who would have been joined by Riley the dog, although these characters never advanced beyond the concept phase. During this exploratory period, Wumpa League was being envisioned as a standalone multiplayer game, but as 2018 went on, the project entered a state of flux. After assembling their initial prototypes, Toys for Bob drew plans to create single-player tutorial levels for the game. These would have essentially served as a way to get players to grips with the moveset of each character before heading online. One of them was set in a prehistoric world where dinosaurs roamed. At some point in the making of these stages, Toys for Bob's leadership decided that they would instead use what they had built to develop a brand new single-player Crash Bandicoot game. This was initially discussed as a possible reboot of the series, codenamed Quantum. They went from putting the finishing touches on their Spyro trilogy to conceptualizing a Crash Bandicoot multiplayer game, and now a single-player title as well, all at various stages of development simultaneously. As work on Spyro was gradually wrapping up, Project Quantum shifted to become the studio's primary focus, with Wumpa League being put on the back burner. Toys for Bob knew that they wanted to do a new single-player Crash, but according to studio head Paul Yan, they arrived at the concept for their project by reviewing the critical and commercial success of each past game. They determined that the pinnacle of the series in terms of both sales and reviews was the first few games. Therefore, they decided to create a direct sequel to Crash Bandicoot Warped, the third game in the series, effectively ignoring titles that had taken place after it in the previous timeline. This project would become known as Crash 4, sometimes stylized with the A in Crash replaced with a 4 in some internal renders. The developers of Crash Bandicoot 4 made a concerted effort to make the game visually distinct from the Insane trilogy from the beginning, reasoning that they did not want it to be perceived as a sequel to the remasters or DLC for it. They wanted it to be immediately recognized as something new and standalone, hence its shift in art design. The look of the game would be guided by art director Josh Nadelberg, who had previously overseen the Spyro Reignited trilogy. Many of the same contracted artists from that project were retained to work on Crash. Over the course of pre-production, the game was subject to a number of notable cuts and changes as the developers honed their vision. At one point, they considered having recurring Crash foil Ripperoo return as a mini-boss in the Run It Bayou level, but this was later excluded due to time and resource constraints. One character that played a major role in the game was an alternate reality version of Crash's past love interest, Torna. Toys for Bob's artists proposed many different takes on the character, such as this rendition by Rob Duenas that adhered more closely to her original design, and some that were more radical, like one from James Lloyd Martin, which imagined her as wielding a boomerang and carrying a baby bandicoot in a pouch. Torna's boomerang was something heavily considered as a possible game mechanic throughout pre-production, appearing in a number of different sketches before being scrapped in favour of a grapple gun. Another element under consideration early on was the idea of having warp rooms, the 3D hubs present in Crash 2 and 3 that allowed players to enter levels in an order of their choosing. These were dropped as the team determined that they wanted to adopt a more linear structure for their narrative and gameplay design. The music of the game was given much thought as well, and could have taken a somewhat different direction at one point. Grant Kirkhope, the composer from such games as GoldenEye and Banjo-Kazooie, created a number of tracks to pitch his take on the game. He wrote demo songs based upon early level descriptions he was provided, but they were ultimately rejected. The final soundtrack was composed by Walter Mayer, who had previously worked on Killzone and Grand Theft Auto. Crash Bandicoot 4, or Quantum, had by all accounts a symbiotic relationship with its counterpart Project Lava, aka Wumpa League. Technology, character movesets, and tutorial levels were lifted from Lava to become the initial basis for Crash 4. A prime example of this is the aforementioned prehistoric stage from Lava, which later evolved into Crash 4's Dino Dash level, wherein the player is chased by a ravenous T-Rex. The notion of Wumpa League including those single-player tutorial levels was abandoned as Crash 4 became established. In a similar vein, many of the concepts for multiplayer maps in Wumpa League were reworked into stages for Crash 4. The Nitro Processing Plant became the level Nitro Processing. Cortex's mountaintop rocket site morphed into the Icy Mountain Lab seen throughout the 11th dimension. Ideas for a map set aboard aircrafts led to a set piece at the end of The Crate Escape, where Crash has to leap between cargo falling out of the back of an aeroplane. Production on Crash Bandicoot 4 lasted around only 18 months between 2018 and 2020. The final level to be added to the game's plan was Offbeat, a New Orleans-inspired stage featuring musical elements and parade floats. This stage was created from scratch just 12 months out from its launch in October 2020. Like the Spyro Reignited trilogy before it, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time was subject to a quick turnaround, despite the fact that staff were forced to work remotely for the last months of its production amid a global pandemic. Over the course of that development, work on Wumpa League stalled after 2018 as they focused on Crash Bandicoot 4, and it went from initially being thought of as a standalone game to possibly being an add-on. During this time, Toys for Bob was considering releasing Wumpa League as a free update for Crash 4 that would launch around 1 year after it did. Crash 4 released in October 2020 on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and according to this early plan, Wumpa League would have followed in around September or October of 2021 on those same platforms. In the months leading up to that, they were set to carry out both closed and open beta tests throughout the summer of 2021. Wumpa League was intended to launch with 12 levels and 16 different playable characters. Most of those would have been returning heroes and villains from across the series, but they had also considered a myriad of fully original characters made specially for this project. During early deliberations in 2018, artist Nicola Saviori put together a poster containing a plethora of fully original Crash characters he had conceived of. Former developers say that this was made as an inspiration piece. None of these new characters were formally approved for inclusion in the game, but served to demonstrate the diverse possibilities of the Crash universe in a multiplayer context. Despite it being a multiplayer project, the developers did explore ways for the Wumpa League to feature narrative elements that could have possibly unfolded over the course of future updates. In-universe, the Wumpa League would have been an esports-style competition set in the Wumpa Islands that attracted people from all over the Crash Bandicoot world. Not only would past Crash characters like Ripperoo or Papu Papu have come out of the woodwork for it, it would have also drawn in previously unseen anthropomorphs from foreign lands, a concept heavily influenced by the Olympics. A multitude of these were sketched out as potential playable characters, many of which were inspired by different places from around the world. For example, there was a German hamster with a Tesla coil helmet who would have been one of Cortex's minions, a Canadian beaver girl, and a mole inspired by a Wyoming coal miner. Others conceptualized included a gun-toting hyena, an opera-singing cow, a pirate bird, and a cat-bat hybrid named Catbat. This last character, which was inspired by David Bowie, was conceived as a creature who could fly through levels and swoop down to attack. It was later teased in one of Crash Bandicoot 4's unlockable ending art pieces, where they could be seen alongside the game's main cast. One story concept floated was that it would eventually become clear that the people behind the Wumpa League competition held some kind of nefarious intentions. The developers discussed an idea for the main villain being an evil CEO pulling the strings from behind the scenes, although how exactly this plot would play out in-game was never determined. While Wumpa League was, at the time, being considered as a possible free update for players of Crash 4, it was set to feature in-game microtransactions whereby players could purchase cosmetics for their characters. A robust selection of skins was being mapped out, all of which could be leveled up by completing matches with them equipped. Through this unique progression system, players could upgrade their skins over time. Every skin was planned to feature 3 different variations, starting off fairly rudimentary before growing gradually more elaborate and flashy. For instance, there were ideas for a zombie Crash skin whose body would gradually decay as you upgraded him, or a Dingodile Space Marine who upon reaching Tier 2 would fall victim to an alien parasite. By Tier 3 the creature would have fully taken over and transformed Dingodile completely. Players would have also been able to collect backpacks, which would contain the different theme parachutes that they could deploy during gameplay. By the summer of 2020, Toys for Bob had devoted over 2 years of on and off work to developing their ideas for the Wumpa League, codenamed Lava. Former workers told me that they were genuinely passionate about the project and believed in its potential. As it quietly continued in the background of Crash 4 midway through the year, the company began drawing plans for a third project that could have possibly been their most ambitious game yet. At the direction of the studio's management, a small team of developers started imagining the future of Crash Bandicoot, which they were simply calling Crash Bandicoot 5. As the name suggests, this was a direct mainline sequel to Crash Bandicoot 4, and like its predecessor, it would have been another single-player 3D platformer that was set to bring back a number of past characters from across the series. Crash 5 intended to reintroduce plot elements to the series that were first established in 2004's Crash Twinsanity. In that game, Crash visits the Academy of Evil, a school for villainous children that was once attended by Dr. Neo Cortex. There they meet Dr. Cortex's niece Nina Cortex and come to blows with the headmistress of the school, Madame Amberly. According to their initial concept, the Academy of Evil would have returned in Crash 5 as the game's main setting. It had been greatly expanded over its previous appearance and would have functioned as a hub world of sorts. Crash would have explored the campus grounds, a dark, foreboding world filled with gothic architecture and danger around every corner. In this incarnation of the Academy, its faculty would have been made up of past Crash Bandicoot villains like N. Gin, Embryo, and Dr. Cortex himself. A major idea that the developers were experimenting with was inspired by the game's Psychonauts, wherein the player enters the consciousnesses of various characters and explores 3D worlds based around their innermost thoughts. Toys for Bob staff were envisioning a similar premise, in which Crash would enter the minds of his greatest enemies and literally delve into their inner turmoil, often gaining greater insight into their backstories. For example, the team had conceptualized a world portraying the subconscious mind of Dr. Cortex. In this realm, players would have traversed a landscape comprised by Cortex's greatest fears and most significant memories. Some ideas for this included seeing him capture Crash and Coco in the wild before their mutations, navigating a creepy circus from his childhood, and meeting Cortex's family, a collection of oddballs and lunatics. There was his elderly mother, Mama Cortex, with her deadly weaponized walker, his hunky Adonis older brother, Hughie Cortex, Ada Cortex, his sinister nephew with a proclivity for experimenting on animals, and his sister Sarah Bella Cortex, who was a high-tech dentist, comparatively the most normal of the bunch. Through the Evil Academy faculty and the concept of invading minds, Toys for Bob was opening the door for more classic Crash villains to make a comeback. One of these returning foes would have been Pinstripe, a Tommy gun-wielding Potteroo from the original Crash game. Within Pinstripe's mind, Crash would have battled his rodent minions through a 1930s gangster theme level before confronting him in his office. En route, he would have possibly been given a glimpse of the family Pinstripe was taken from prior to his mutation. Another recurring baddie set to resurface was Tiny Tiger, whose mindscape would have manifested as a medieval-style area inspired by Dungeons & Dragons. In this section, Crash would have to navigate a perilous castle rigged with traps, making his way down to its cellar where he would find Tiny's lair, a hoard of gold, treasure, and weapons. Tiny would have eventually emerged from the shadows to fight him in the depths of his subconscious. Other characters lurking the Academy that were sketched out included Madame Amberly and Nina Cortex. This was the original concept for Crash 5, but as time went on, the project's ambitions expanded well past the scope of the Evil Academy. Soon they decided that the game's main antagonist would be Uka Uka, the masked spirit introduced in Crash Bandicoot Warped, who was set up to re-emerge in Crash 4's secret ending. In Crash 5, he would have returned with a vengeance, wreaking havoc across the Academy of Evil and beyond. In the story, Uka Uka would have gained access to an interdimensional portal hidden beneath the Academy that would allow him to travel to the universe of Spyro the Dragon. There he would use his magic on the Dragon Elders, cursing one of each of their feathers in a ritual to corrupt them. The Dragon Elders would then do his bidding, plunging Spyro's dimension into chaos, and in turn threatening Crash's home as well. Crash and Coco would follow his path of destruction and embark on an adventure traveling to and from Spyro's reality in pursuit. They would eventually encounter and befriend the heroic dragon, teaming up to restore the Dragon Elders and defeat Uka Uka. They would follow him through the various realms from the original Spyro game like artisans, beastmakers, and magic crafters, which they would find besieged by Uka Uka's sorcery. Along their journey, they'd collect dragon feathers as they undid the dark magic afflicting the various characters they'd run into. There were some considerations for feathers that would grant characters different special powers, similar to the masks from Crash 4. In addition to a variety of different dragons, other legacy Spyro characters like the Norks from the first game were being weighed up for appearances as well. On top of that, the team did contemplate adding more gender-swapped alternate universe characters into the mix, similar to how they did with Entropy in Crash 4. Female versions of the Komodo brothers from Crash Bandicoot 2 were among those sketched out. Following around several months of early work, this was the core concept behind Crash Bandicoot 5, a full-fledged Crash and Spyro crossover, bringing back past elements from across both franchises. The project largely existed as concept art, with some early demo environments tested out. One of these was Tiny's lair, which gives us a glimpse at some of the more open level design we could have seen in the game, recalling titles like Crash to Insanity. According to the developers I spoke with, Crash and Spyro were intended to be the two main playable characters, with Nina Cortex and Coco also under consideration. Among the small group at the company who worked on the game, there was a lot of excitement for it. One source shared that they were enticed by the prospect of reimagining old Spyro worlds in the style of classic Crash gameplay. The team had conceptualized everything from Crash riding on Spyro's back, or using him as a weapon, to Spyro lifting him up to aid in platforming. There were considerations for them being playable both separately and together in a potential mashup of the two movesets. Many possibilities like these were being discussed, with plenty subject to change. One prevalent idea that the developers had talked about was finally shedding some light on Uka Uka's backstory, revealing the source of his rivalry with Aku Aku. The team looked at using their mind invasion concept to have Crash explore his fractured memories, gradually piecing together his history. They were even ruminating on potentially showing the two masks in their original humanoid forms. It was a slightly darker sequel compared to the light-hearted It's About Time, both in terms of visuals and storytelling, with a greater emphasis on fleshing out the series' lore. Crash 5 was worked on for around 3 to 4 months between summer and November 2020 in an early pre-production state. In that intervening space of time, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time launched on October 2nd, 2020 for the Xbox One and PS4. Toys for Bob planned to port it to the Nintendo Switch and PC for 2021. The studio's relatively small size had prevented them from being able to release it simultaneously on all platforms. Crash Bandicoot 4 received generally very positive reviews and became the highest rated Toys for Bob game yet at the time of release, gaining an 85% critic score on Metacritic. According to sources from Activision, the publisher had high sales targets for the game internally. This was largely due to the massive success of the Crash Insane trilogy that had sold well over 10 million copies by this point. Activision hoped that it would perform comparably, which it didn't quite manage to do. While Crash 4 was moderately successful by all accounts, its initial performance didn't live up to their lofty expectations. Although it secured the top spot on UK sales charts for 2 consecutive weeks, physical launch sales were down 80% from the Insane trilogy, according to GameIndustry.biz. In the US, sales were down too. Here's a telling statistic from Nielsen's Super Data Research, which tracked digital sales data for video games throughout the US. In particular, they reported first month sales. The Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy released on June 30th, 2017, and despite it coming out on the final day of that month, it recorded 520,000 digital sales on that day alone. Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time launched on October 2nd, 2020 and sold 402,000 throughout that entire month in the same region. The Insane trilogy comfortably outsold it within 1 day versus 30 days. Super Data Research speculated that Crash 4 being priced at $59.99, $20 more than the Insane trilogy, and launching in a crowded release season could have harmed its sales potential. Less than 2 weeks before its debut, Nintendo published Super Mario 3D All-Stars, a collection of 3D Mario platformers that was highly successful. In the days leading up to it, breakout hits like Hades and Genshin Impact landed. On the same day as Crash 4, EA released a new Star Wars game, Star Wars Squadrons, on the same platforms as it. FIFA 2021 came out 1 week later. To make matters worse, Activision had dropped Crash 4 1 month before the launch of the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles, with no next-generation versions or upgrades announced. Those wouldn't arrive until the following year. When I spoke to different former Toys for Bob employees, however, they pointed to the lack of a Nintendo Switch version at launch as a critical mistake, citing the popularity of 3D platformers on that console. Activision has been coy about the exact numbers Crash Bandicoot 4 sold in the years after, but according to the people I spoke to, it was financially successful. In 2024, Toys for Bob design director Toby Schacht claimed on LinkedIn that it had reached 5 million units sold. Within the first month, though, it fell short of Activision's high expectations, with drastic consequences. Throughout the summer of 2020, work on Wumpa League, or Lava, slowed down, and days after Crash 4's launch, the project was being second-guessed altogether. Since 2018, Toys for Bob had gone back and forth on whether Wumpa League would be released as an add-on or a standalone game. By the time Crash 4 was finished, there was still some uncertainty around this. In the end, Activision wasn't interested in either and shot down their proposal to put it into full production, sending them back to the drawing board. Ex-developers indicated that the publisher had lost confidence in it, motivated at least in part by early Crash 4 sales numbers. By the time it was halted, a considerable amount of progress had been made on it. A variety of different character movesets had been built, and dozens of skins practically finished. As October 2020 went on, the company's heads believed that they would have a better chance of justifying its existence to Activision Blizzard if it became linked to other properties they owned. As such, they drew plans to revamp the Wumpa League as a crossover multiplayer game centered around an all-star lineup of Blizzard icons. This quickly morphed into being focused solely on World of Warcraft characters like Thrall and Uther the Lightbringer, all of which were reimagined in a cartoony art style akin to the studio's previous works. It was intended to have essentially the same gameplay style as Wumpa League, a competitive multiplayer platformer. Developers who were privy to this pitch said that internally there was limited enthusiasm for this shakeup, but it would prove ultimately short-lived. Blizzard had no interest in this alternate take on their franchise and shot down the idea towards the end of October. In the weeks that followed, Toys for Bob attempted to salvage some of their work by again repurposing the bones of the project. In November 2020, they developed a pitch for what could have been their first original property since Skylanders, which was called Monster Mechs. This was planned to be an online multiplayer game about small creatures who would pilot mech suits to do battle. Players could collect different parts like arms, legs, and chest armor, and create their own mech by combining together the pieces they liked best. This endeavor lasted only a few weeks before being rejected by Activision, who was not interested in funding it. Then, 6 weeks after Crash Bandicoot 4 launched, the axe fell on its planned sequel. Its developers had hoped to transition into full production in the near future, building upon what they had learned from both Crash 4 and the Spyro Reignited trilogy to take their work to new heights. Despite an extensively mapped out plan, Activision was not willing to move forward with it. In November 2020, Crash Bandicoot 5 was cancelled. The publisher was, in general, pulling back from producing big-budget single-player games at the time, and had turned down a number of such pitches from their other subsidiaries, including new Tony Hawk titles. Instead, they wanted to focus on multiplayer franchises using the games as a service model, which had proven financially successful. The initial sales figures for Crash 4 only spurred them on further in this direction. In the aftermath of Crash 5's cancellation, there were brief talks about combining their Crash Spyro crossover and multiplayer concepts together, but for the time being, Project Lava was effectively shelved. As Toys for Bob's projects were shut down, Activision decided that they would begin to work primarily on providing support for future Call of Duty releases. They joined around 3,000 other people across various studios around the world that were working on the franchise at the time. Amid this reshuffling, numerous employees expressed their profound disappointment to me about this turn of events. The making of Crash 4 and Wumpa League by all accounts had a scrappy, improvisational quality to it, a lot of room for experimentation with ideas regularly in flux. By the time Crash 5 came around, the developers had honed their process, and had a much stronger sense of direction going into it. They had learned a lot from the last game, and with that experience came a newfound sense of confidence that they would be able to improve upon those foundations, but they were ultimately denied the chance to prove that. In the months after, a number of developers from Crash 4 began to leave the studio, some of which were disillusioned by the fate of its sequel and completely opposed to working on Call of Duty, according to several people I spoke to. Josh Nadelberg, the art director behind the Spyro Reignited trilogy and Crash 4, departed the company in February 2021. Jan Steck, Crash 4's lead designer, left in March 2021. Nick Livingston, the studio's longtime executive producer, who'd been there since 2006, left in May 2021. All three of these, incidentally, went to work for Phoenix Labs, a Vancouver-based developer known for games like Dauntless and Fae Farm. Despite the reality of the situation, rumours began to percolate around this time that Toys for Bob was developing a new Spyro game. This was based almost solely on the official art book for Crash Bandicoot 4. Page 252 of the book contains art of the Snacks Dimension, one of the later worlds from the game. In this image, a building with a statue of Spyro can be seen, with his name beneath it. The artist responsible for this illustration, Bronk Crows, wrote a short paragraph describing his work. Quote, "It was fun to combine Dingo's Diner with the futuristic element, to have those cars with the city below, and a little hint at Spyro. Many fans took this to mean that Toys for Bob was teasing a new Spyro title, leading to a number of news outlets picking up the story. One site, GameReactor.eu, even went as far as using the headline Spyro 4 all but confirmed. Regardless of all this hype, Toys for Bob was not working on Spyro 4 at the time, nor was this image teasing anything. I confirmed this after contacting Bronk Crows, the artist behind the piece, who told me that it wasn't a hint at a new game at all. He was a freelancer who worked on the project via an external outsourcing studio for art, and was not directed by Toys for Bob or Activision to add Spyro. It was entirely his decision. He had no knowledge of any new Spyro project, and simply included it as a nod towards a character he liked. Spyro is referenced in Easter eggs throughout Crash 4, and the Spyro building seen in the art book doesn't even appear in the actual game. In reality, it was nothing more than one artist having fun with their assignment. Toys for Bob, by all accounts, gave artists a lot of room for self-expression and allowed them to put their stamp on their work. For instance, an artist named Brett Bean would sometimes depict Wumpa Fruit as living beings in his sketches. Through the first months of 2021, most of Toys for Bob staff worked on content for Call of Duty Warzone, while a small group completed development on the Switch, next-gen and PC versions of Crash 4. In the absence of an original project of their own being commissioned, their management attempted to keep as many of their staff employed as they could by picking up additional support work on Overwatch 2 for Blizzard. They did this in the hope that they would get to go back to larger original projects with as much of the Crash 4 team intact as possible. However, multiple ex-workers have since told me that the experience of working with Blizzard on Overwatch 2 was miserable, citing an impersonal management style and an unclear creative direction that often fluctuated on a whim. Some even told me that being put on Call of Duty felt like a punishment from Activision for failing to live up to their expectations. One former developer provided the following comments on Activision's treatment of Toys for Bob's workers at the time. Quote, "The idea that the team that had been built at Toys for Bob would be an appropriate team to work on Call of Duty was just completely off. At that moment, it was clear that Activision just did not care about who we were, what we did, whether or not we were a good fit for it. They didn't really care who we were as a studio or as a team." Towards the start of 2021, Toys for Bob was not able to find enough support work to keep all of their developers together, and had to begin letting people go. Later, on April 29th of that same year, Toys for Bob shared on their social media that they were supporting the development of Call of Duty Warzone Season 3. This prompted numerous developers to come forward, revealing that they were no longer employed by the company. One of these was Blake Maloof, a designer who had worked there for over a decade, who tweeted, quote, "I no longer work at Toys for Bob," with a crying emoji. Another person to speak out about the situation was Nicholas Cole, a character designer who had served there since 2017. He said it was, quote, "the end of an era," and that everyone he had interfaced with and worked alongside had been let go. Furthermore, when asked if Toys for Bob was only working on Call of Duty at the time, Cole replied simply, "Yep." GameIndustry.biz reported on the story, and one day later Activision reached out to them, attempting to change the narrative around the situation. Quote, "Reports of layoffs at Toys for Bob are incorrect. There has not been a reduction in personnel recently at the studio. The development team is operating fully and has a number of full-time job openings at this time. The studio is excited to continue supporting Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time, and more recently provide additional development support to Call of Duty Warzone." The statement was worded fairly nebulously. For instance, the line, "there has not been a reduction in personnel recently at the studio," which carefully avoided establishing the exact period of time they were referring to. This statement was issued in April, and the people affected were let go towards the start of the year. Technically, there were no layoffs at Toys for Bob around this time, as they said, but neither Nicholas Cole or any other employees ever claimed otherwise. With all that said, their claim that there was no reduction in personnel was clearly false. Many of Toys for Bob's workers at the time were there on a contract basis. These people worked for them full time and did essentially the same amounts of work expected from people in permanent positions, but got paid less and had fewer benefits, as I've mentioned. Activision, like many other publishers, uses contract work as a cost-cutting measure. In the first months of 2021, as Toys for Bob was unable to secure enough work for them, a number of people did not have their contracts renewed, and so they were let go. This mostly impacted the company's art department, which was heavily reduced, although people in other roles like designers were affected too. Some of these contractors had been there for over half a decade, going back as far as the Skylanders days. Out of the former developers I spoke to, for them getting their contract renewed every several months was just a formality. They had no expectation that they were going to be let go. Generally, most people would not define those as layoffs, but the effect is very similar. To say that there was no reduction in personnel was simply not truthful, hence why Nicholas Cole, for example, said that everyone he interfaced with had been let go. As for their claim that Toys for Bob would continue supporting Crash Bandicoot 4, that didn't turn out to be accurate either. Toys for Bob did not work on any additional content or even patches for it after this statement was made. For some of the contractors I spoke to, this saga was a last twist of the knife from an organisation that often made them feel less valued than full-time workers, despite the substantial contributions they made to the games they worked on. An example pointed out to me by former employees of how little Activision valued these workers can be found in the credit sequences of Crash Bandicoot 4 and the Spyro Reignited trilogy. In both games, the pets belonging to full-time staffers at Toys for Bob received a higher billing in the credits than their contracted art team. I spoke to a number of these former contractors, one of whom offered this comment, quote, "I love the people at Toys for Bob. There were individuals there that did their best to make us feel part of the team. But as an organization, Activision or Toys for Bob, wherever the buck stopped, it was made clear that we were considered ultimately pretty disposable by the end." Throughout the remainder of 2021, the studio's main assignment was contributing to Call of Duty Warzone and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Partway into the year, however, their management resumed exploring ways for them to do their own original projects. From these discussions emerged the idea to reboot Project Lava once more and attempt to rework it into something Activision would be willing to greenlight. As opposed to being an update for Crash 4, Lava was revived as a budget standalone spin-off game catered to Activision sensibilities. It would be a live service multiplayer title with a seasonal battle pass system that would be built primarily from recycled Crash 4 assets and would require little R&D due to the extensive amount already done on Wumpa League. While that iteration of the project had fully original worlds, this new game would consist of stages based around levels from Crash 4, like Rude Awakening and Insanity Peak. This approach would make it cost-effective and relatively quick to develop. Crash 4 had since been released on more platforms like Nintendo Switch and PC. These ports strengthened sales numbers, helping to alleviate concerns about the viability of the IP. Activision approved of their new concept, setting in motion the game that would eventually come to be known as Crash Team Rumble. While a lot of the relatively small studio continued providing support for Call of Duty, the remainder worked on Rumble. The game's ambitions were vastly scaled back from what was proposed with Wumpa League. Not only were plans for fully original locations dropped, the levels in Rumble were generally much smaller arena-type environments than those built for its prior iteration. Due to this downsizing, the parachute mechanic that had previously enabled players to glide around its expansive environments was dropped entirely, although the game retained the backpacks that once housed them as unlockable cosmetics. The idea of having multi-tiered skins that would evolve as players leveled them up was stripped out too, in another example of budget trimming. Rumble also abandoned the concept of having other types of fruits scattered throughout levels. While melons were removed entirely, the idea behind bananas, pads players had to stand on to capture, was reworked into gems. These functioned essentially the same, but would provide a temporary boost to the amount of Wumpa fruit banked by a team if they managed to activate a full set of gem pads. Another old idea that made a return was the Wumpa Whale. Previously, this was a stage element players could ride on to amass Wumpa, but in Rumble it was reimagined as its own mode. Players had to collect relics from around stages and bring them to a bank to summon the Wumpa Whale. The team to successfully bring about the whale would rapidly gain Wumpa, while the opposing team would have to frighten the creature off by collecting rubber ducks. The whale in the final game maintained the low-poly appearance of the model used during the prototyping phase. This game type was experimented with throughout Crash Team Rumble's run, appearing occasionally as a limited time mode. While the developers had considered including story content of some kind during Wumpa League, Rumble did away with that notion altogether and was focused solely on a multiplayer experience. The only hint of any narrative elements existed outside the game itself. Alongside each seasonal update, Toys for Bob released a short webcomic introducing each new character. These comics were illustrated by Nicola Saviori, who had previously worked at Toys for Bob on Spyro, Crash 4, and Rumble's earlier incarnations. The first of these told the backstory of Catbat, a character originally imagined for Wumpa League who was revealed to have been an escaped experiment of Cortex's with a passion for rock music. Catbat would, in the end, be the only original character to be carried over from Wumpa League to Crash Team Rumble. For some former Toys for Bob workers, seeing Wumpa League be reworked into a new scaled-back form was a bittersweet experience. Here's what one of them had to say about that. Quote, "I think Rumble was fun, but Rumble was a skeleton of what it was intended to be in the end. Very few assets were created originally for Rumble. It was all asset reuse from the games we did create. Very little of what was intended to be the multiplayer project actually survived. but the core of the gameplay loop I actually thought was still fun. I just feel like all around you could sense that it was not given the full love and attention it would have gotten had it been developed as a serious product. While Toys for Bob was quietly pitching their revival of Project Lava in mid-2021, speculation around the Wumpa League reached a fever pitch. Although that iteration of the project was effectively no more by this point, it was widely believed to still be coming. This was largely down to two different factors. Assets from Wumpa League were discovered inside Crash 4, and the fact that a piece of official marketing material had referenced Wumpa League by name. Back at the end of November 2020, after Wumpa League had stopped development, the official Crash Bandicoot social media accounts released an advertisement paying homage to the Uncharted series. In this clip, Crash and Coco are seen playing Uncharted 4, a nod to a scene from that game in which Nathan Drake and Elena Fisher play the original Crash Bandicoot. This video primarily served as an advertisement for Crash 4 going into the holiday season, but it also included a small teaser for the once planned Wumpa League. As the camera pulls away from Crash and Coco, a sign spelling out the words Wumpa League can be seen in the distance. I spoke to an Activision source who revealed that this video was locked in months before being posted. Regardless, it would lead to lasting confusion as rumours and speculation ran rampant throughout 2021. A number of different theories gained traction over this period, the most prominent of which baselessly claimed that Wumpa League was a party game linked to the PS1 spin-off title Crash Bash. Further fuel was dumped onto the fire by Toys for Bob themselves during an August 2021 GDC presentation on the making of Crash Bandicoot 4. During this talk, studio head Paul Yan discussed the early days of pre-production when they were deliberating over what Crash 4 would and would not be, attempting to hone in on its identity. As he talked about this, he displayed a slide in which Wumpa League could be seen among the different facets of Crash 4's development listed, gesturing towards the fact that the two projects were developed in tandem. On another occasion, the presentation briefly cut to a cropped piece of key art from Wumpa League. In both instances, Paul Yan didn't verbally acknowledge these references and continued talking in what was clearly supposed to be a tip of the hat towards an unrealized concept they had once hoped to produce. On top of that, in September 2021, they released a video marking Crash's 25th anniversary, which ended with co-studio head Avery Lodato saying, "Happy 25th anniversary, Crash, we'll see more of you very soon." With this, discourse around the project only grew more frenzied. In December of 2021, this would lead to the official Twitter account for the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire tweeting a poll which asked, "For real, where is Wumpa League?" Over 3,000 people participated in the poll, with Dead emerging as the top choice. Whereas its former iteration Wumpa League was no more by this point, Project Lava was very much alive, quietly under development at Toys for Bob, although it would be another 12 months before fans would get to see it. While Toys for Bob projects before it had utilised outsourcing as standard practice, Crash Team Rumble leaned on it slightly more heavily. Due to their art department being reduced considerably in 2021, external companies like Airborne Studios in Germany were contracted to pick up the slack. Airborne had previously worked on both Crash 4 and Wumpa League, but their contribution to Rumble was slightly more extensive. They helped to realise stages for the game and a multitude of different skins for characters. Over the course of development, the core team continued to experiment with ideas for how those skins would be doled out, and how monetization around the game would function. At one point, they considered having a premium currency that could be purchased with real money called Wumpa Bucks. In the end, they chose a Battle Pass system, and Wumpa Bucks were reworked into Crash Coins, a currency introduced in Crash Team Rumble Season 2 that could be spent to skip tiers of the Battle Pass without playing. The game would ultimately be set for a June 2023 release. In the meantime, fans would endure a year of false theories and hoaxes, suggesting it would appear at Summer Games Fest, Gamescom, and other events. It was eventually announced in December 2022 at the Game Awards, wherein a Crash Bandicoot mascot rappelled down onto the stage to present its debut trailer. The unveiling brought to a close 2 solid years of speculation following the initial Wumpa League teasers in late 2020. It was set for release on PS4, PS5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series consoles. In the following months, advertising around it was sparse, with only occasional details trickling out through press previews. It was revealed that the game would receive both standard and deluxe editions. The standard version, which was digital only, was sold for $30 or £25 in the UK, whereas the deluxe retailed for $40 or £35 and was available both physically and digitally. The standard included a premium battle pass for the first season, while the deluxe had premium battle passes for seasons 1 and 2, the option to instantly unlock the first 25 tiers of season 1's battle pass, and an unlock code for the proto pack. This was a line of exclusive skins derived from the prototype character models used in their early Wumpa League demo. Both editions came with pre-order bonuses, which were access to a retro Tawna skin and entry into a closed beta held on the 20th of April 2023. Toys for Bob had planned a stream of new content lasting at least 1 year after launch, but according to some involved in the development, Activision was already pulling back on their support for it before it was even released. Around the launch of Crash Team Rumble, an outsourced studio that had been working closely with Activision on the game was told that their services would no longer be required. This came as a surprise to those involved who had previously been under the impression they would be working on the game into the indefinite future. Crash Team Rumble was finally released on the 20th of June 2023 and received mixed reviews from critics, landing an average score of 67 on Metacritic. Many praised its core gameplay loop while criticizing its monetization and progression systems. Sales for the title were markedly slow out of the gate. After just 2 weeks on the market, it was outsold in the UK by the Crash N. Sane trilogy, which released 6 years prior. By the following week, it had dropped out of the charts altogether. 5 days after launch, Videogamer.com reported that Rumble's viewing figures on Twitch had already dipped below 30 people, a figure they used to brand the game as dead on arrival. TrueTrophies.com was another source for the game's underwhelming metrics. Their data indicated that during launch week, its PS5 player count was 69% lower than a 2-year-old Peppa Pig game. It then hemorrhaged active players in the subsequent weeks, dropping out of the top 200 most played games on the PlayStation Network within its first month on sale. After having been in the works on and off since 2017, Crash Team Rumble arrived late to a live service trend in the games industry. The market for games like this had become largely consolidated into a handful of heavy hitters like Fortnite and Call of Duty, and in 2023, carving out an audience in this competitive field was becoming increasingly difficult. In the months leading up to Rumble's release, numerous live service titles were discontinued, including Marvel's Avengers, Babylon's Fall, Crossfire X, Knockout City, and Rumbleverse. All of these came to an end in the first half of 2023 alone. Crash Team Rumble, like many of these games, failed to make a dent. Shortly after its launch, I set up a survey to find out why so many people had chosen not to play it. From around 500 people, here were the most popular reasons given. 12% of people said that it was not released on their platform of choice. The game launched only on PlayStation and Xbox consoles, skipping PC and Nintendo Switch altogether. 16% of those surveyed cited concerns about the payment model, the entry-level premium price tag, and all the battle pass and microtransaction systems. Many other more popular live service games like Overwatch 2 or Call of Duty have offered an entry-level free-to-play version, but Crash Team Rumble did not. Its cheapest version was sold for $30, and the game was heavily monetized with microtransactions within. 25% of people voted for what I would summarize as ineffective marketing or lack thereof. Many people responded by saying that they'd never even heard of the game, and a similarly large group told me that they didn't understand what it was. Either marketing didn't reach them or failed to convey what the game was. It debuted with a trailer that was entirely CGI, and when Activision finally did show in-game footage months later, there was no attempt to explain how the game actually worked. Audiences were told that it was a 4v4 game where you play as different Crash characters and attack one another, but that was about it. By far the most popular reason why people didn't play it, however, was that they were not interested in playing a Crash game in this style. 40% of the people who responded indicated that they were simply not looking for an arena-style online multiplayer Crash game with live service elements, and this was something that commentators had raised the alarm about during previews. Kotaku's Kenneth Shepard, for instance, said the following: "I can't help but feel like, regardless of the game's merits and problems, it's facing an uphill battle because it's just not what Crash Bandicoot fans want. Crash Team Rumble already has a lot going against it in the eyes of purist Crash fans. It's not a platformer and it's not a kart racer. That core loop is solid, but it's likely not what the average Crash fan is looking for these days." The article also mentioned the potential of Crash Team Rumble going free to play in an effort to grow its player base. This was something that Activision never chose to pull the trigger on, although Toys for Bob did attempt to lure in new players in the months after launch. Starting in August 2023, they held occasional 4-day free trials where anyone could download a limited version of the game for free with a few different characters to try. They also offered double XP weekends for people with the full game. New content was periodically added, including more characters like Ripperoo and a number of experimental new modes. However, these efforts failed to move the needle in any meaningful way in terms of growing Rumble's audience. In the game's second season, they continued adding new maps and limited time modes, as well as kicking off an ongoing crossover with the Spyro franchise. This season introduced Spyro 2 villain Ripto as a playable character whose arrival was explained via a short tie-in comic as him being inadvertently summoned through a dimensional portal. The addition of Ripto would herald the arrival of more Spyro characters in Season 3, which started in December, the Purple Dragon himself and his friend Allura. This round of content came with 2 new maps, both based around locations from the series, Artisan's Arena and Summer Forest. Season 3 also marked the conclusion of the webcomic series, which saw Crash characters travelling to Spyro's dimension and recruiting him to deal with Ripto. 3 years after the cancellation of Crash Bandicoot 5, Toys for Bob was finally able to realise their Crash Spyro crossover within Crash Team Rumble. Unbeknownst to many, they even hid material from Crash 5 in the game. Special unlockable banners were included in the Season 3 Battle Pass, which were made from concept art created for Crash 5. This included one named Tag Team, in which Crash and Spyro can be seen adventuring together in the Beastmaker's world. In typical winking Toys for Bob fashion, the developers were able to sneak in nods to a project that they were never able to bring to fruition. The studio's efforts to build excitement around Crash Team Rumble were, in the end, unsuccessful. The small spikes in engagement generated by new characters proved short-lived, and by the end of 2023, its future was looking more and more uncertain. A Nintendo Switch version of the game had been in development, but was cancelled by Activision due to the lack of interest in the other versions. In the final months of the year, Toys for Bob began to look to the future, starting work on a brand new game and mulling over plans to sunset Crash Team Rumble. According to former developers, they aimed to deliver a 4th and final season in 2024. This was set to add Nina Cortex to the roster, a character that had previously been outlined to appear in Crash 5, whose design from that project they were reusing. The developers had once done preliminary work towards more characters beyond this, like Tiny Tiger, Pinstripe, and the original male version of Entropy, but these were eventually nixed to focus on delivering Season 4. Alongside work on this, they were creating an original IP, what would have been their first in well over a decade, that was planned to use Unreal Engine 5. Hype around this new venture was growing internally as 2024 began, but the company's plans were about to be upended once again by external forces. In October 2023, Microsoft completed its acquisition of Activision Blizzard, following an extensive and tumultuous battle with regulators. They now owned one of gaming's biggest publishers, and Toys for Bob with it. From early on, developers told me there were concerns about how this seismic shift in the industry would impact them, but it wasn't until the 25th of January 2024 that the reality of the situation set in. On this day, Microsoft Gaming CEO Phil Spencer sent out an internal memo which opened as follows. It's been a little over 3 months since the Activision, Blizzard and King teams joined Microsoft. As we move forward in 2024, the leadership of Microsoft Gaming and Activision Blizzard is committed to aligning on a strategy and an execution plan with a sustainable cost structure that will support the whole of our growing business. Together we've set priorities, identified areas of overlap, and ensured that we're all aligned on the best opportunities for growth. He went on to say that he and other members of Microsoft's management had made the, quote, painful decision to lay off an enormous 1,900 people across Activision Blizzard, ZeniMax and other Xbox teams. The email caused panic across their various subsidiaries as they gradually found out who among them would be affected. In my conversations with developers, They described the process as incredibly disorganized and stressful. On that day, the confusion and lack of clear communication from leadership was such that developers were contacting journalists rather than their own bosses to find out what was happening. Bloomberg's Jason Schreier, for example, tweeted the following: "These Xbox layoffs are such a mess that staff across Activision Blizzard are texting me to try to find out if they might be impacted. Nearly 2,000 job cuts, and people now just have to wait around to see if they're part of the bloodbath." As the hours went by, it eventually became clear that Toys for Bob would be heavily affected by the restructuring. 35 of their developers were laid off amid this sudden shakeup. At its peak during Crash 4, the studio had employed around 180 people. They were now down to just 50. The layoffs affected junior developers and longtime Toys for Bob veterans alike. One of the latter was lead concept artist Ron Key, who had been with the company for a decade. He had been serving as art director on their new IP in development when Microsoft's changes took hold. In the days after, I learned about many different stories of how the layoffs affected people, but here's one example that I think speaks to the scale and severity of what happened. Mayha Murthy was a designer at Toys for Bob who worked on Crash Team Rumble. One of her contributions to the game was writing humorous, self-aware messages that appeared during loading screens. Some of these cheekily nodded towards the project's protracted development cycle and ideas that were cut along the way. Like many others at the studio, she found out that she was losing her job from the news media rather than being told by her employers. In February 2024, Murthy got in touch with Activision looking to be reimbursed for her ticket to the 2024 Game Developers Conference, an event set to take place 1 month from then. Typically, this would have been covered by Activision since she was employed there, but the sudden and unexpected layoffs left her uncertain. She was told to email Activision's accounting department with the request, and so she did. This was the response she received, which she later shared on social media. Quote, "Hello, I am sorry, but that is not something we can confirm. It would need to come from the travel department or maybe your former department. The travel department was liquidated. We are trying to find out who has taken over their tasks, but we have not been given any guidance yet." To clarify, this former employee who had been laid off emailed Activision's accountants who told her that they would not be able to help her get reimbursed and that she would need to contact the travel department. However, the entire travel department had been laid off as well, so they didn't know what to do because Activision had yet to replace the person who would have dictated what to do in this situation, since that role was also reduced. This is just a small slice of what some people were faced with in early 2024, and it serves to illustrate the bedlam that Microsoft left in their wake. The Activision Blizzard layoffs were met with intense criticism from consumers, journalists, and politicians alike. The FTC, who had tried unsuccessfully to prevent Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, claimed that the tech giant had made false promises about how it intended to run the publisher. Microsoft had stated unequivocally in court that they intended to be hands-off in their management of Activision Blizzard and said that they would be able to operate independently. In Phil Spencer's own words, however, they had just admitted that the layoffs were implemented to eliminate areas of overlap between Microsoft and Activision Blizzard, suggesting that it was not operating independently at all. One commentator critical of the mass layoffs was game industry veteran Joseph Chivitate, who claimed that days later the publisher was already attempting to poach developers from other big companies. Chivitate, a well-connected 3D artist who had worked in the industry for around 20 years, alleged that recruiters from Activision Blizzard contacted people at places like Rockstar attempting to hire away developers already in full-time positions. Here's what he had to say about the stories he had been hearing. Quote, "Activision Blizzard would rather try to poach someone who's currently employed instead of hiring any of their talented, recently laid off former employees into the role, or transferring them instead of laying them off in the first place. Applying for jobs at Activision Blizzard is just data harvesting for them. They would rather poach someone else who's currently employed just to eventually lay them off too the next time Microsoft needs to make their stock price go up a nickel to meet their quarterly quotas." Microsoft released their quarterly earnings report 5 days after the restructuring, revealing that their gaming revenues had gone up 61%, largely due to the Activision Blizzard acquisition. Days later, Toys for Bob's headquarters in California was shuttered as part of the new cuts. While many of their staff had worked remotely in the previous few years, their vibrant tiki-themed offices had been held up as a source of pride for the company. With their HQ closed, the remaining staff switched to working remotely full-time in February 2024, a month that would bring further upheaval. Some reports at the time attempted to spin the situation in a positive light, but these claims are difficult to reconcile with the reality behind the scenes. Microsoft's overhaul of Activision Blizzard devastated Toys for Bob. Along with 40% of their workforce being abruptly laid off and their offices closed, the cost-cutting led to their new IP being discontinued and Crash Team Rumble's life support being pulled. Rumble had started with tepid sales and never managed to recover. Adding Spyro and other characters had done little to turn things around. For some perspective, let's briefly compare its Twitch viewership numbers to two other Activision Blizzard live service games active at the time. On the 12th of February 2024, over 52,000 people were watching live streams of Call of Duty Warzone. Overwatch 2 had around 58,000 viewers. Crash Team Rumble had an average of 7. The game never came anywhere close to breaking out of its niche audience. As a result, plans for a fourth and last season were scrapped. It was around just over 1 month away from being ready at the time the call was made. With support for the project now gone, developers hastily reworked some of what they had finished, like unreleased cosmetics, as part of a final free battle pass. The game was set up to end on a whimper compared to the bang they had once hoped to go out on. As the dust was settling, Toys for Bob's heads entered discussions with Microsoft to go independent. The studio had been a part of the Activision umbrella for nearly 2 decades, and had seen its share of highs and lows since then. With fresh leadership overseeing Activision Blizzard, they took the opportunity to renegotiate the terms of their relationship and were successful. Microsoft granted them their independence and a fresh start. On the 28th of February 2024, the company's future plans were revealed to the public via a blog entry on their website. Quote, "We're thrilled to announce that Toys for Bob is spinning off as an independent game development studio. This opportunity allows us to return to our roots of being a small and nimble studio." In that same post, they announced that they were exploring a potential partnership with Microsoft on a new project. Less than an hour later, the fate of Crash Team Rumble was officially confirmed, when a message quietly appeared in the game's home menu. It stated that March 4th, 2024 would mark its final content update, although the game would continue to be playable. Microtransactions were being discontinued, and a free 500-tier battle pass was to be made available for all users, which had unlockables from previous seasons and 104 new items made up of content once planned for future updates. It even included an unlockable Season 4 icon in memory of the final season that they were prevented from finishing. The end of Crash Team Rumble was noticeably unceremonious. Outside of this single, concisely worded message, neither Toys for Bob or Activision chose to acknowledge it on any of their official channels. No eulogies from the development team, no mentions of it on social media, or even their official website. This would lead to some confusion among fans who hadn't seen the easily missed in-game message that would later vanish altogether. For context, Toys for Bob had routinely made posts about their in-game events on sites like Twitter and Facebook in the months prior. Even when the game made a bevy of content free for users on March 4th, all parties remained quiet on it. It was clear that the project was something that they had chosen to move on from. In the end, the studio managed to weather this storm under an embattled Activision Blizzard. They entered a new era of independence, setting their sights on a partnership with Microsoft. Over the previous several years, they had gradually lost a lot of their workers, their headquarters, and suffered multiple cancellations along the way. This was the outcome of a parent company in crisis that had lost faith in traditional single-player games, struggling to find a place for Toys for Bob in their pivot towards the games-as-a-service model. Activision originally purchased the company at a time when its speciality was making middle-tier budget platformers. Despite how successful their single-player games continue to be, the publisher had Toys for Bob move away from what they had been built to do in order to supplement their drive for live service content. This disconnected, one-size-fits-all management style led to a slump in morale, developers leaving, and eventually an online-only Crash game that audiences rejected. Consider also the fact that in the almost 20 years that Activision owned Toys for Bob, they were only ever allowed to ship one original IP, and it was the most successful endeavour they ever embarked upon together. After squeezing every last penny out of Skylanders, Activision then refused to ever again take a gamble on any new property they wanted to attempt, as they became increasingly averse to risk. Even a Crash Bandicoot cross-Spyro platformer was deemed too big of a leap. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to support the work I do, go to patreon.com/LiamRobertson, where I make exclusive videos and other content for supporters. I've been Liam, and I hope you'll join me for another Game History Secrets.